Good morning, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Regulation Navigation with Warren Miller, brought to you by ITS. This webinar series is centered around various regulation-related topics that cover operator qualification basics and give an opportunity for you to learn something new and validate what you may already know. Today, we'll discuss steps operators need to take to comply with the latest final rule that's now come into effect, dubbed the Valve Installation and Minimum Rupture Detection Standards Rule. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session will be recorded. As a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice and should not be utilized as your only source of information. Please review the disclaimer on screen before acting on any advice given and seek guidance from legal counsel or other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. With that out of the way, hi, I'm Chris Taylor. I'm the Director of Learning and Content Development here at ITS, and I'm here to facilitate this discussion with Warren Miller, former PHMSA regulator and current ITS regulatory compliance specialist. Warren, thanks for joining me. So before we jump into the analysis of the final rule, Warren, do you mind talking through the intent of the new rule? Why has the regulation changed?
Chris, this dates back to 2010 when we had two pretty bad events that occurred, one in San Bruno and one in Marshall, Michigan. This plays out of the mega rule that was originally introduced a number of years ago. This has been in development for many years and is just, again, part of the mega rule that's been introduced in this last year.
Thanks. This rule dropped back in April of this year, and the first requirement went into effect just last month. Let's review some key dates regarding this final rule and what operators need in place going forward.
The final rule actually came out April 8th of 22. And the first effective date was October 5th. Operators had to have procedures in place on that date. If you haven't made changes to your program, you're running late. I really want to emphasize that. And then April 10th of 23 is the next big date, which is basically a year after the final rule was published. And this is going to require transmission pipeline segments that are greater than 6 inches or equal to, that are constructed or replaced, have to consider putting in rupture mitigation valve or some alternative technology.
And as I understand it, this final rule not only affects transmission operators, but also distribution operators as well. And maybe we can start there.
It does. There are a couple of key points a lot of folks didn't pick up on, and want to make sure that everybody knows that not only distribution, hazardous liquid, and natural gas, it's requiring each operator to make immediate and direct notification to 911 or whatever the call center is that an operator would have along their pipeline to make adequate means of communication, letting folks know, hey, we have had an accident, an incident, whatever the requirements are, and have these as written procedures. So they've come out very pointedly stating what an operator has to put out to put into their plan. And again, this is something that was required as of October the 5th.
And now this piece, like I think we just stated, it's already in effect, and this should already be in an operator's O&M and emergency plan, right?
You bet. The requirements called out in 615 for the gas side, 192,615. So that's, under operations for natural gas. So, depending on where you have that requirement, and it may want it in both places.
And it's calling out, the 911 notifications calling out a notification upon a potential rupture. And the new rule added that as a definition. What is a potential rupture?
Ken, this term has, been put out by PHMSA, and it's actually up on the gas side, 192,635. And so this would be something you'd actually have to have, again, for whoever's going to be making calls in case you do have a potential rupture on your pipeline. This would be, unanticipated, unexplained pressure loss. They've called it at 10%. So if you've got your normal operating pressures of 100 pounds and you have a pressure loss of 10% or greater within 15 minutes, they would expect an operator to have that in their procedure that, hey, we dropped 10 pounds or 10%. We need to make this call, consider that we've had a rupture. Certainly operations wise, operators across the country, 10% could be inside their normal changes in operation. So you'd want to make sure that in procedures, you've got the statement of your changes, your percentage of change that would trigger that notification. And certainly looking for any type of rapid release or pressure drop or explosion, again, having that requirement to make those notifications.
There were also new requirements in the final rule for conducting incident investigations. What's now required?
So they have specifically spelled out what an operator has to have in their procedures. So they've got to develop, implement, and incorporate lessons learned from post-failure, incident review, accident review, and you've got to have that in procedure and stating, what you will look at. Again, lessons learned. So anybody that has had a reportable accident or incident, and this would be from October 5th. So, the fact is if you don't even have a procedure, but you've had a reportable, you're on the hook to get this investigation done. And if there are lessons learned, you've got to incorporate those into written procedures. And this could be your, company training, OQ qualifications, and certainly depending on where it's applicable, design, construction, testing, maintenance, operation, and emergency procedure manual. So there's a lot that they have specifically tied together as a requirement because if you looked at 617 on the gas side, it was just a statement that you will do an accident investigation or incident investigation. Now they have gone into greater detail. And, if the incident or accident involves a closure of an RMV or that other technology, that's something we'll be talking about just here a little bit later.
Well, speaking of lessons learned, we always say, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen in the eyes of the regulator. So I would imagine that applies here. It
does, and if they've got, if they've had anything that's reportable, they've got to take certain actions. And there's got to be that documentation to show that they did the review. Again, if they didn't learn lessons, fine, but they're, an inspector, whether it's from PHMSA or a state, can say, let me see your review. And, they can scrutinize what an operator, took out of their review, and should it have been incorporated into somewhere else in their program to make it better. And then, like I say, we talked about this RMV, if it was involved, that there's a 90-day window, which closes quickly. So really want to make sure that you get on the ball if something occurs.
Next, we'd like to cover more on the transmission side of the new rule, with the high points that affect both gas transmission, hazardous liquid, and gas gathering type A operators. But we're going to reference the requirements for the gas transmission under the 192 rule, since most of our audience here today are from gas distribution and transmission operator companies. But please understand that there are specific requirements and exceptions existing in the Part 195 regulated pipelines. Warren, you've been talking about RMVs. Let's start out with that. What are those?
Well, it's basically an automatic shutoff valve, remote control valve. And certainly operators may have some of these, but it's used to minimize the volume of gas that would be released from the pipeline and help mitigate the consequences of a rupture. In real loose terms, it's kind of like an excess flow valve, but this would be something that's a much grander scale, again, for transmission.
Thanks for that. So Warren, what do you consider to be the most significant change affecting transmission operators?
Well, the first two requirements, so this is for onshore transmission, again, and type A gathering. That's pipelines are 6 inches or greater that have either been constructed, new construction, or entirely replaced after April 10th, 2023. At that point, an operator must, and they've got must in the regulation, install rupture mitigation valve or an alternative equivalent technology whenever a valve must be installed to meet the appropriate valve spacing. Understand this is over a 5-mile section, 2 miles aggregate. So if you're replacing, if you've got, it doesn't have to be 2 continuous miles inside that 5-mile section. It can be broken up.
Okay, yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, RMVs must be installed on newly constructed or entirely replaced lines within that constraint of 2 miles aggregate within a 5-mile contiguous pipeline anytime after April 10th. So plan accordingly, because that's coming up pretty quick here. But when they say alternative technologies or alternative equivalent technologies, what do they mean by that?
PHMSA's allowed operators to say, hey, we're just going to use other valves, regular valves for that use. The big thing to understand is if an operator does not use an RMV, they've got to make notification to PHMSA on this alternative technology, and 90 days in advance of using it. After the 91st day, if PHMSA has not responded one way or another, the operator can go ahead and use it. But PHMSA can also come back within that 90-day window and say, hey, we need more time to review, or we don't approve. And in that case, then the operator is going to have to probably go with an RMV. But the big thing about using just a regular valve, the thing is, it has to meet the RMV requirements, which is to be able to close within 30 minutes of the notification of a possible rupture. So that would include, if you're just doing a regular valve and somebody's got to go out and manually close it, got to make sure that that person is able to get out there, leave their home or office, wherever they're at, get to the valve and get it shut within 30 minutes. And you have to have documentation that it can be done.
So what if an operator, for a specific pipeline project that's really, a different case, what if they determine that installation of these is infeasible for their line? What do they do?
Well, they can, operators are allowed to make notification if the compliance deadline is infeasible.
Okay.
But I don't think that they're going to consider that the use of RMVs or some other technology is infeasible to actually use. So they talk about the ability of it's either technically, economically, or operationally infeasible. Again, going to have some pretty strong justification just to extend the deadlines of the replacement, I believe. So if you're coming up on that 24-month window, let's say this was done because of a class location change, and all of a sudden your 24 months is coming up, and oh, we can't get this RMV because, again, if there's a lot of construction or replacement going on, these RMVs may be tough to get hold of, may be able to justify, hey, we're not going to be able to get this within that 24-month. We need 6 more months because suppliers can't get it. There may be the justification.
So there's no exemption language in there. It sounds like this is a deadline extension and that's it. Yeah. Some of the requirements for spacing of these valves or these RMVs are based on a line's class location. So let's pull back and do a basic primer on class locations in general. What are they, and what are the RMV spacing requirements for each?
Well, if you look at this slide that we've got up here, of course, class 1 is the least populated area. It's class location with 10 or fewer buildings intended for occupancy. So each of these class locations is safety factors for more and more buildings, and of course the exposure to people. And so on class 1 right now, the RMV spacing is scheduled for 20 miles is the widest, the distance between the 2 valves. Class location, class 2 would be 15 miles, class 3, 8 miles, and class 4 is 5 miles. So if you're in a class 4, again, class 4 would be the highest population area. This would be where buildings over 4 stories are prevalent. Certainly downtown many downtowns would be class 4 locations. If you've got a pipeline that close to downtown, they've built up around, then you've got to worry about the exposure of an incident in those locations. That's why these are being looked at.
And class locations, they're not static, right? They change over time. What are some of the reasons class locations change?
Mainly is growth along the pipeline. I happened to live in Houston a number of years ago, and the town just kept growing out further and further out of downtown, and out where we were actually at, they were putting in 500 to 10,000 homes in a building, basically its own community. But again, they can grow right up to the pipelines, and all of a sudden you've been in a class 1 location, and then here are 500 homes put in near that pipeline. You've gone from a class 1 to a class 3 very quickly, and that's an extreme. But even as anywhere across the country, as buildings, churches, things come up, are built along a right-of-way, these class locations change. That's why operators have to do class location studies to keep up with those.
And so there's a time requirement, right, on class locations change. What was it, 24 months?
24 months once they know that the class location has changed. They have to make those changes. And as the previous slide showed, they've got to take that action. That's why we were talking about 24 months may be really tight, depending on how they have planned. This one actually breaks down that continuous. So we've got continuous 5 miles along the right of way, and I've got a half-mile section, a mile section, and a quarter. This would be consideration for class location, but you could also put this as the same slide if you had corrosion along your pipeline and you had to, remove pipe. The timing, again, is that 24 months.
Excellent. And so, and then there's the requirement as well that they can't exceed 20 miles and they must have RMVs or an alternative technology in between that, right? Is that?
Well, one of the things that they came back with is said, okay, if that pipe replacement for that class location change is less than 2 miles within that 5 miles, then you've got to make sure at least that there's valve spacing is correct. Again, we just talked about the 20, 15, 8 or 4 miles, depending on what class location, or install those RMVs and the sections can't exceed 20 mile spacing at any point there. But again, that's if you're less than the 2 miles. So it does give an opportunity to not have to do it, but you've also got to review and make sure you've got yourself covered.
Well, the decision tree on screen here really drives it home for me now. So it's you have a pipeline replacement, and it's less than 2 miles, again, in aggregate within a 5 mile contiguous section of the pipeline. Then you either have to ensure that the valve spacing is correct per 179A, just valve spacing in general, or you must install RMVs or an alternative tech. But then when it's 2 miles or more, you can't use the valve spacing from 179A. You have to do an RMV,
right,
or alternative tech. Okay, that helps make a lot of sense. So if I'm an operator and I'm in pipeline project planning, and I'm going to be running a new line through a section of town that is expected to have significant growth, this is definitely something to be keeping in mind, just to know that you might have class locations changes and you might have to continuously, comply with the valve spacing rules. So maybe this is a good forward thinking, something really to pay attention to. Definitely.
This is where that multi-year planning is going to play a big part for operators. I think it'll pay dividends to really, be aware. Folks in planning need to know about this regulation, and certainly, folks from compliance would let them know. But as growth goes, if you just changing from a class 1 to a class 2, changing your valve spacing, but then in 2 more years, you're in a class 3, you've got to add additional valving. These are not cheap. None of these, no valve really is cheap, but the work to deploy, folks to go out and do the work, none of that is cheap anymore. So to plan ahead, it may pay to go ahead and consider putting valve spacing in for a class 3. That will get you some time down the road before that growth hopefully doesn't go to a class 4.
We just kind of covered this a little bit ago. We're going to get in more in depth now. So walk me through this. Operators now have these RMVs in their system. They have the proper spacing determined by their class location. When one of these RMVs goes off, what happens, and how are operators now required to respond?
Well, this kind of what we were talking about with that accident and investigation up earlier. Certainly, it's activated, or you've had to shut the your line in using another valve, but then you've got to perform an analysis and actually find out did it work right. If it closed, you must, I'm making the assumption that you did have a rupture.
Right.
That's what they're supposed to do, is work. If it closed and you didn't have a rupture, then of course, then there's that consideration. Okay, why did it do it? So you'll have to investigate that. But if you did have that rupture, so you've had a reportable incident, then you've got to go into that analysis to say, okay, what happened with our, O&M? What do we need to make some changes here to make sure that we don't have a reoccurrence of whatever occurred to make that RMV actually operate. So there's a lot of considerations, and it's spelled out in quite detail about the factors that the operators have to review on each one.
And there are additional requirements for analyzing when the RMVs trigger or activate. And what, yeah, I think we just covered this slide. Yeah. So are there any other requirements or considerations that could drive an operator to need to use or use an RMV?
One thing I didn't talk about, I'm sorry.
Let's go back.
Talking about that analysis is they have 90 days to complete that analysis. So even though the failure investigation may continue on, because again, you're going to have kind of two different things going on, certainly is the analysis of the RMV itself has to be completed with 90 days. And when they talk about completed, that means it's got to be completed and signed off by a company official that summary's been done. And then until the investigation's done, they have to kind of be involved quarterly to make sure, okay, what's going on, and then until that final post summary, is filed. And that summary has to be on that RMV, has to be kept. It does not have to be right now, it does not have to be sent to PHMSA, but they've got to have that documentation if PHMSA or the state regulator comes in for review. Apologize about that.
Yeah, no worries. And they're much more prescriptive now. So like I was posing, are there any other requirements or considerations an operator should consider to use an RMV? Are there any other use cases here?
Well, the big thing is that, after this summary, it may drive them to say, okay, we've got issues with operations. We may have to, have, changes. But the bigger thing is with an integrity management under 935, there is a risk analysis. And so operators have always had to do risk analysis, for the factors that affect their pipeline. Now they've got to do a risk analysis for gas release and protection against rupture. And so an operator is going to have to look and consider an RMV as a possible remedy for their preventative and mitigative measures. Again, if it would be efficient means of, adding additional protection. And again, that's going to be one of those things that has to be included in the risk analysis, has to be documented that you did review it. And talks about making that determination. Operators got to consider the timing of leak detection, pipe shutdown capabilities, type of gas being transported, operating pressures, the potential of the potential release, and just how fast, how much product they would lose, the pipeline profile. And there's a number of other factors. So those all have to be considered in that risk analysis. So they've spelled it out. This is that prescriptive regulation that's been spelled out. And if they do determine that an RMV would be required, excuse me, then it would have to meet the applicable parts of the rest of this regulation.
So not a really simple final rule here. I want to review with the audience what was discussed today are only highlights. Please ensure you review the rule with your teams, with your company personnel, that where all of this has impacts to. Review it in its entirety. You should probably already have done that and have that in your O&M and your emergency plans now. If not, you are behind the 8 ball. Again, this part became effective last month. and will be effective in April on those new and replaced pipelines. Again, this rule also not only affects gas transmission, but it also affects gas gathering type A operators and hazardous liquid operators in the Part 195, as well as the distribution are affected, like we said, for the 911 notifications. Warren, why should gas distribution operators also be paying attention to some of the things that affect just the transmission side? Why should they be cognizant of those requirements?
I think because of the requirement for the reporting to, on this, in this rule. So it's kind of like, okay, if you happen to have something, a rupture on your pipeline, then you've got to also make that notification. And so again, documentation. So that would be documentation that could be reviewed and scrutinized, and considerations for, okay, we're having, these ruptures in the distribution side, may need to consider some type of technology like this for those pipeline operators.
Just kind of looking at the rule, it with the lessons learned, with the new requirements on conducting incident investigations, it seems like it's kind of the plan, do, check, act kind of mantra that you see in pipeline safety management systems, and kind of requirements within like integrity management requirements, where that seems to be a common theme now in regulation. Does the theme of continuous improvement being required in code, do you see that as continuing? Do you think we'll see a lot more of that as the new final rules come out?
They'll never go backwards. I think that,
okay.
And again, as we talked about before, every accident anybody has across the country affects pipeline safety regulations, because the scrutiny is greater and greater with the use of the internet, with everybody, and concerns for safety. So we have an aging infrastructure out there. So anytime something occurs, that also provides just additional data points to say, okay, we need to address this. NTSB making recommendation, Congress mandating, those are areas that will continue to happen.
Well, before we jump into what we call our final takeaways, we always pick top 5 takeaways. We will be taking questions today. So in Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature in your user interface. At this time, please enter in those questions, and we'll be answering those. Warren, take us away with the top 5 takeaways.
All right. As we talked about from the start, October 5th was the date. So if you haven't amended definitions and procedures, specifically that notification and that incident investigation, do not delay. The dates are there, so that they've got deadlines, and you've got those requirements. Certainly ensure that any personnel who plan for new construction or pipeline replacement projects for your company are aware of these new requirements. It's for consideration. It's just got to be wary of that, and also look ahead. The valve monitoring and operating capabilities, understand that R&B of this technology has got to be capable of being monitored either remotely or by on-site personnel, as applicable. And then the alternative technology must be able to be closed within 30 minutes of notification of that rupture, and documentation to prove it. And I can't emphasize that enough. And again, you have to make notification to PHMSA if you're going to use that alternative technology. And then on that last thing is, operators need to show through that risk analysis process required by integrity management a review has been performed to determine if an RMV or the alternative technology would be efficient means of adding protection to a high consequence area in the event of a release.
Thank you for recapping the session for us with those takeaways, Warren. Like we stated just a minute ago, these are just highlights of all the requirements in the new final rule. We'll be sending out these takeaways and include a link to the final rule in our follow-up email after this webinar. Again, highly recommended for you and your teams to review the rule in its entirety. Hopefully you've already done so and have taken action. At this time, we'd like to talk through any questions that you have. If you have not done so yet, again, please enter those in the Q&A. Our marketing officer here, hi, Kayla Huggins.
Hello.
She'll be posing these questions. If we don't get to your question here on air, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually afterwards. Kayla, what's our first question?
Thank you, Chris. So we do have a couple questions. We'll try to get through all of them today. If not, Chris, like you said, we'll follow up. Our first question is, does the 30-minute response time apply for all valves or only those RMVs? And are we expected to manually close those valves within 30 minutes?
So again, the RMVs are typically going to be automatic, and they are required to close within 30 minutes. And then PHMSA stated any alternative technology also has to do the close within that 30 minutes. So whether you're manually closing them or by whatever other means, 30 minutes is a kind of a stop. You know, it's got to be done that way.
Thank you, Warren. Our next question is, most items are generally supported by the O&M as a whole. Are we going to be expected to write in a section tying them together?
That's what these regulations are pushing. They're trying to, integrate all of the information. They've got both notification, they've got the incident investigation, how these valves, got to operate. I don't think it's required that you make a brand new section for RMVs. I think you could, put it along with the way your manuals are set up, but definitely want to address them somewhere and tie them well together. Reference, whatever your method is.
Thanks, Warren. This next one's kind of a lot, so I'm going to try to read it pretty slow and make sure I'm covering it. If you have a pipeline which is currently being constructed and 3 spreads are complete and valves are set, but the 4th spread may not be complete by that April 10th deadline, will the operator be held to the requirements of RMV for the entire line or only the spread that's not complete?
Love these gray areas. Everybody always throws the gray areas at me. I think that if you have completed the 3 spreads, I believe you would probably not be held to that valve spacing. The 4th definitely would. This is one of those, it might do to, talk to your regulator, but sometimes ignorance is better than knowing too. So that's why it's such a gray area. But I would hope, since those are complete, those projects are complete, and you can, show that one spread would probably be one that you'd be held accountable for.
It sounds like it's really kind of going to depend on your relationship with and kind of the regulatory environment in your state and where you're operating. Like, that's going to depend on that. And then kind of like how you classify your project. It's well, all these 3 parts are done, you still have 1 left.
Yeah. But if it's interstate, I think,
then it's,
All right. I've got one last question.
Okay.
Do you anticipate new covered task qualifications for the product and the procedures?
Good question. Since the RMVs will be a different, it could be a different valve for an operator, they may want that as a separate OQ task, especially if their covered task list is developed with by type of equipment, which some people's are. I think that some of the requirements of if you're using alternative technology and you're having them go out and close valves within 30 minutes, I don't know that that would change somebody's qualification. Again, it's going to be the documentation that it can actually be done in 30 minutes is probably going to be the more important thing on that part.
Thank you, Warren. We did have one more just come in, and we've got some time. I figured we could just cover it really quick. It's just for clarification. So we did mention earlier that 30-minute rule for all valves. 192.636 is applying to new installations and replacements. That 30-minute rule does not apply to existing valves, correct?
Correct. No, this, all we've been talking about, and I'm sorry if I've confused anybody, is the use of RMVs or that alternative technology that's required by this new final rule. And your existing valves are where they're at, and so yeah, need to make sure that that's understood.
Thank you, Warren. Chris, that's all we've got.
Thank you, Kayla. And Warren, thank you for your time and expertise today, walking us through the recap of the final rule. Again, it is now effective and will impact projects in April of next year. You, our audience, we really appreciate you coming. We've gotten a lot of feedback from you and love hearing from you. Please continue to reach out to us. And if you have questions or concerns about your own operations, your own OQ plans and programs, etc., Warren and our ITS team offer a range of consulting services. So please get with us. We'd love to talk to you and give you good advice or do consulting. We have our next webinar in the Regulation Navigation series slated for the first quarter of next year. However, we don't yet have a next topic. So we'd love, again, to hear from you. We'd love to drive these off of your feedback and interest. But we will be announcing that. And so if you're new, you can use the a QR code scanner and scan that code there, or go to the web address you see on screen. That's its-training.com/home/regnav. And again, our next topic and the specific date and time will be announced soon. If you're, we hope that you got a lot out of this, and again, want to hear from you. Please continue to join us for upcoming sessions. Thank you and stay safe.